Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Margha mid-month teaching. I thought that I would talk today to all of you a bit about the Way of the Bodhisattva, this book that we've been reading, and to give you some ideas or thoughts around how to read this kind of a text. Something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and actually when I was in graduate school, it was one of the main focuses of my work, was looking at how this kind of a text, these kinds of old traditional texts, how when we read them, they work on us as human beings. In other words, how do they transform us? How could they transform us? What would be the way in which that would happen? So what I would like to do is just share with you some of the ways that I've thought about that, some of the things that I've discovered around that process, and hope that that will help you when you're reading this book, because sometimes these kinds of texts can feel a little distant and a little out of tune, and certainly a lot of the language in the Bodhisattva is based around the time of Shantideva. And he was speaking to a particular kind of audience, although the truth is his primary audience was himself. And that's one of the things that I want to discuss with everyone this morning. So the first question that I would ask you is, how does this text by Shantideva, how does it function to transform us as ethical persons? In other words, there's a theory in literature that basically described as the agency of the text, that a text isn't an inert, passive object, but it's an object that performs a certain kind of action in the world. And when we read such texts, we enter into the activity of that text, and we allow that text to do the work that it's meant to do on us. That the text can work to transform us if we're open to and available to its message, its strategies, its format, its content, obviously. So what kind of an agency does the text have? What kind of an agency does this text have? And what kind of a reader does this text imagine? Does it assume? Those are two questions I want to just explore first, because if we can begin to have a sense of what the action of the text is, and then how the text is asking us to position ourselves so that we can receive the message, so that we can actually be transformed by this text, rather than reading it as a kind of dry theoretical or somewhat distant kind of message out there. How is reading something like this, how is it possible for it to be a transformative experience through which we learn more about what it means to be a full human being, or perhaps in this case, a fully compassionate human being, a fully awakened human being? And within that, I would say that then the strategies that are built into this text are working to bring into being a certain kind of person. And we might start to ask ourselves, well, what does that person look like? What are the characteristics of that person? And then when we read the text, we begin to look for clues inside the text as to what this kind of enlightened or liberated or compassionate person might actually look like. So you could say that, and this is, for those of you who have done any reading in literary theory, there's a term that was coined by the writer Umberto Eco, who's also a literary theorist, and he describes that the reader who is open and available to being transformed by the text as a model reader. A model reader is a reader who is open and available to the text's strategies. So part of our job as readers is to try to discover, what does that reader look like? Not only what is the kind of person formed by the text, the enlightened, awakened person, but what kind of a reader do we need to be in order to comply with the project of this text, rather than just being sort of a passive recipient passing through it. So those are a couple of questions to hold in mind when you are reading this text. And another thing to just mention is that one of the most unique things about this particular text is that it is such an evocative, personal statement. This is not a doctrinal exposition of some kind. He's not exploring different tenets. He's not creating a commentary on another text. He's actually writing a very evocative poem to himself, basically, to himself. It's said that he wrote this in his little monastic cell, and no one knew what he was even doing. It wasn't anything he showed to anybody. It was something he did in private by himself. And what's interesting, what's important about it is that there's such a sense of the person, such a sense of presence in this text. You really get a sense of the human being behind this work, and the human being who is engaged in this activity of self-narration in the process of forming himself as a particular kind of person. So there's something powerful here about the process of writing one's life, or writing one's life, really. Bringing one's life together in the form of a narrative, which is a way by which we can start to evaluate and look deeply into who we are. It's a way that at least the way this book is presented, it's a way that we can develop compassion. It's a way that we can transform ourselves. So there's an interesting kind of element in this text that has to do with the power of writing, and writing about the self. And there's a lot of theory in ethics around putting one's experience into narrative form. We talk a lot about how, the thinking mind, we don't want to spend too much time spinning out our stories. We're trying to limit that kind of conceptual activity. But the fact is that, in another sense, the bringing together of life in a narrative as a human being allows us to put together certain kinds of templates, essentially, ways of thinking about ourselves within which we can organize the ingredients of our social and spiritual and moral life. And that if we don't have that capacity, if we don't have that kind of practice even, that we are missing out on meaningful frameworks for ethical action. I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm going to be offering Berry Center for Buddhist Studies does these 1.5 year long courses, and I'm going to be doing one on the writing of spiritual autobiography, and in which I'm going to ask people basically over the course of this period of time that we'll be working together to bring their lives together in the form of a spiritual autobiography, a spiritual narrative, and we'll be going through all kinds of exercises and ways of doing that. So in a sense, that's what Shantideva is doing in this book, although his project is even more specific than that. He's really focusing on narrative as a means by which to bring himself into the full realization of bodhicitta and ultimately of wisdom, liberation itself. So how do we read this as an example? What is a way to, what should we look for? What should we think about as we're reading this text? One of the things to just notice initially is that within the world of this text, so you can sometimes think of a book as like it's a world, and I'm sure for those of you who read fiction or who read literature, really good literature brings you into a world, and you forget your external world. You become, this is the world that you're living in during the time that you're reading the book. And so you can say that there is a kind of world inside the text. And inside this world, Shantideva is by himself, and he's speaking to himself. So it's the self speaking to the self exhorting the self singing to the self encouraging the self examining the self. There's this dialogue that he sets up inside himself in order to begin to really examine who and what he is in relationship to this notion of bodhicitta. So we might start to look at the kinds of, well, first let's go to the actual form of this text, the form of this text. And by that I mean the text is structured in a certain way, right? It is a series of exhortations to oneself in poetic form. It's a poem. So its form is a poem. Let's just start with that. And the scaffolding for this poem is the 6 paramitas, right? He's using the 6 paramitas as a scaffolding within which to poetically express all the different ways that he is working to understand fully, deeply, what it means to be a genuine bodhisattva. And I would suggest that not only is he looking to discover how to form himself as a bodhisattva, but that he is also enacting a very powerful mechanism to generate self-compassion. That in a sense, this text could be read as a powerful example of what it would mean to truly develop self-compassion. Not only compassion for other, but self-compassion. So I actually invite you to explore that too. How might the example that he sets in here show us something about what it means to be compassionate to oneself? See if you can tease out any of those threads, if you can find ways in which you think that that might be happening. And that might be challenging because he can be very forceful in his language, and it can sound very critical, as if he's being highly critical of himself. But I would ask you to look slightly beyond that level of the text, that there is a kind of energetic force to his language. Remember too that of course this text is written many, many hundreds of years ago, and is it necessarily the case that being forceful with oneself, using the kind of language that he uses, is necessarily critical? Is it critical, or is something else going on there? And if something else is going on, what is it? What do you think it is? So we have this poetic text, that uses as its scaffolding the 6 paramitas. It's also a very evocative text. It expresses a kind of poetic vision, and it's a way of communicating, using poetry or fictional writing, lyrical writing, you could say, is a different way of communicating than when we teach a scripture, for example, or we read some kind of didactic exposition or explanation of a term or an aspect of the Buddhist path, or on emptiness or something. This way of communicating, the poetic way of communicating, actually helps to bypass some of the conceptual mind's ruminations. Its tendency to want to keep everything on the intellectual level. And the poetry is far more appealing to emotion and to accessing a deeper and more organic layer of our being. I think I may have said this before, but sometimes this kind of style, poetic style, lyrical style, there's a philosopher, Martha Nussbaum, and she describes this kind of communication, textual communication, as love's knowledge. That something's being communicated that has to do with love, that has to do with compassion, actually, and it's built into the very form itself. So poetry communicates far more to our felt, our emotional being, than it does to our intellectual mind. And there's a reason, there's got to be a reason that Shantideva decided to do that. He certainly had the capacity to write a didactic text, right? To say something that was much more instructional and much more teachy, so to speak. But instead he decided to do this. And so it's an appeal not just to the conceptual processes, but it's also reaching beyond that to a deeper experience of non-conceptual recognition. And in that sense, then you could say that the text is actually more closer to or more permeable by the actual nature of the mind itself, by the qualities of the natural mind, the qualities that we've been practicing and studying with this whole year so far. That when we read a poem, when we get engaged in this kind of a text, we're more able to contact some of those kinds of qualities of openness, kindness, freshness, heartfeltness, genuineness. This is a very, very real text. He's not honest, you might say. He is about as honest as a person can be, and about as uncompromising in his intention to examine, uncover, and reveal all of his layers of self-deception, of hypocrisy, of laziness, of lack of determination, of impatience, anger. I mean, he's not willing to leave a single stone unturned in his examination of the self, and looking to understand how it is that this self is so enmeshed in these different neurotic patterns, and what can be done to begin to break him free of those, what needs to happen. So you could say the form of the poem itself, it's in a kind of powerful, skillful means for contacting and awakening an inner and deeper resonance within us that goes beyond the conceptual striving that we usually get caught up in. Sometimes this book is described as a kind of catalyst to ignite the fire of awareness and compassion that can burn away any impediment. And you might think about that, this notion of igniting something, because it's such a, like emotionally energetic text. There's something really burning inside this text, some energy that is really inflamed, and he's riding that energy, and he's fanning that energy. He's fanning those flames with pretty much every verse, just building that fire higher and higher, brighter and brighter, hotter and hotter, and trying to burn away whatever is in the way of developing full bodhicitta, full enlightenment, really, full realization of what it means to be an ethical human being. And at the same time, he maybe not, I don't imagine he was necessarily thinking this way, but maybe he was. This kind of text demonstrates the power of the poetic imagination and of writing to transform the writer. So there's something in the act of writing that is a practice in and of itself of waking up. And this book is a demonstration of that. He's using his imagination, and he's using what he writes to imagine himself in the image of the person that he would like to be, a person for whom bodhicitta is the most important dimension of being alive. And this is a strategy that you see very often in Buddhism, especially in the Vajrayana. In some sense, you could almost call this a tantric text, which is sort of an interesting thing to say, because it's very much considered a Mahayana text. But I think in some cases, in some senses, it is kind of a tantric text, because it's using the imagination, these imaginative thought experiments that he's putting himself through. And he shows us how, by using the imagination to conjure up these scenarios, let's say, that it begins to help him break apart his self-oriented patterns of thinking and enable him to open up more and more and more. And by virtue of him doing that and us coming along as the reader who identifies with the narrator. I mean, this is generally one of the fascinating and powerful things about literature, is that when there's a clear narrator, and a narrator that is more or less sympathetic, or even not, even a non-sympathetic narrator, we find ourselves either willingly or happily and, almost eagerly identifying with the narrator, or we might find ourselves identifying with the narrator sort of reluctantly, like, I don't really, and holding back a bit, because we're not sure that this narrator is the kind of person we want to be. But nevertheless, there's this resonance between the reader and the narrator. So he's using these imaginative thought experiments, these poetic ways of expressing different situations, to open and uncover hidden places of his own self-centeredness, his hypocrisy. He doesn't shy away from any part of himself, right? And in that way, this is one of the ways in which I feel strongly that this is a tremendous act of self-compassion, this book, that he is, he's practicing turning towards, and he's demonstrating what it means to turn towards and go directly into the difficult inside of himself. Now, he doesn't necessarily express himself the way we might if we did the same thing, but he is not at all afraid to turn towards himself. And sometimes I think that that kind of energetic dimension to this text, the sort of fiery aspect of it, is his way of not turning away, not getting intimidated, or just resisting the project of really looking deeply into what's there. So in that sense, you could say that this text is an example of what self-compassion could look like, because remember, compassion and self-compassion are not necessarily warm and fuzzy. I've said this a lot, and I think you all know this, but that there's this spectrum of energies and activities that fall within the realm of what we might call compassion, qualities that fall within that realm. And it's, compassion fundamentally means whatever is most skillful in waking us up, and and that can look like many, many different kinds of things. Okay, so that's sort of a long way of talking about the form of the text. Content of the text, and we've already kind of touched on this too, but again, within the text, there's this narrator that we are assuming is Shantideva. Now, we actually, you really, from a literary theory standpoint, it's not considered correct to assume that the narrator is the same as the writer. And in fact, it's true, the narrator is never the same as the writer. Narrators very often take on a life of their own. And this is an interesting thing to think about too. So if you were writing something, if you were writing a journal, and journal's a little different, but if you're writing something, well, no, it's not actually. If you're writing something in which there's a first-person narrator, you might imagine that that narrator is you. But the narrator actually takes on a life of his or her own inside the text, and that can be very surprising and even awakening to the writer. So I think that Shantideva probably understood that, and that he wanted the text to take on a power and a life of its own to wake him up, and that was part of the creative process that he was engaging in. And then, this text is arguably one of the most famous, most well-read Buddhist texts in the entire Buddhist canon, literary canon. And so clearly something was communicated here that wasn't just for him, right? Something resonated so deeply with those who read this text. It's almost like you can't help but find yourself transformed by it, even if you don't consciously set yourself up as a reader who's available to transformation. But it's almost like you kind of can't help it because it's so forceful. So anyway, our narrator, who we're going to say is at least an imaginative vision of Shantideva, right? We can't necessarily say this is exactly Shantideva, but he's exploring, again, the conditions that are necessary to experience and uphold this deepest and most fundamental and awakened part of who we are, what needs to be there. And he's trying to model the activities and the state of mind, the orientation that is needed in order to really ignite the fire of compassion within us. So within the content of the text, you find all kinds of exhortations, monologues, scoldings, encouragements, ruminations, thought experiments. He's got this range of different ways that he talks to himself. And in each one of them, you see this process whereby the self is talking to the self. The self is creating a certain kind of relationship to the self, or breaking down certain kinds of relationships that it already has to the self. And that's something to keep in mind too, is he actually creating a new self here that is a self that is in line with, in harmony with the Buddhist teachings, with the development of bodhicitta, or is he breaking down a self? The solidity, the reification, the reference point of a self that was purely self-centered, that was living from that narrow perspective of I and me and mine, and that this is a way to sort of begin to dissolve that self-fixation and to relax and let go into openness and into compassion, and allow those qualities of compassion to arise more easily when they're not so reified and frozen from the perspective of from the dualistic perspective of the I and other. So it could be either of those, or it could be both of those. There's the creation of a new self, and then there's also the dissolution of the old self. And the new self has very different qualities, very different ways of manifesting. So there's a lot of play within this text between the relative and the ultimate. And I have the sense that was probably intentional on his part. Or if not intentional, then it arose out of his own realization. That if he got out of the way enough of himself, that what it came through in his writing was a profound teaching. And I mean, it is a profound teaching. There's just no doubt. It's an existential song of what it would really mean to connect to love, to connect to compassion, to connect to kindness for all beings through this uncompromising willingness to be honest with oneself, to take responsibility for oneself, to really see all the ways that we hold back, all the ways that we don't really want to do it, to really do it. So I would say that some of the essential questions that this text is asking the reader, and of course was asking the writer, what really needs to happen in order for us to genuinely awaken the heart of bodhicitta? What really needs to happen? And how do we really free ourselves from self-absorption and self-centeredness and reactive emotional patterns? How do we do that? What's needed to do that? If we look for an answer in this text, we might say that what's modeled for us is this seeing oneself clearly, all the way down to the bottom, and seeing our darkness, befriending it, perhaps engaging it through different skillful means, dissolving it, letting go of fixed ideas, fixed views, and learning how to work with the mind to overcome self-absorption and self-centeredness and negativity. So not only are there poetic ways of doing that, but there are also various kinds of logic that Shantideva is using to convince himself to let go and to relax and to live from a place of awakened heart. And there's something very generous, actually, about he's actually very generous with himself, by which I mean that he is giving himself so many opportunities to break through, to really touch into the deepest level of what is the awakened heart. It's like the 84,000 different methods that he's got his own version of these, and he is putting them down in writing and playing with them or working with them. So there's a kind of tremendous generosity to himself, the narrator's generosity to himself within the text. So in a sense, you could say he really demonstrates what it means to sort of exercise oneself through the acts of imagination, through the acts of contemplation, through the acts of thought, through the acts of literary expression. And by exercise oneself, I mean, it really does mean what exercise usually means: to strengthen oneself, to limber oneself up, to make oneself more pliable, to give oneself more resilience and more strength and endurance. And the result is, his attitude is not so much self-renunciation, but it's almost like this is an act of the book is an act of self-confession as truth-telling and as affirmation, right? It's as Foucault describes, it's a work of oneself upon oneself in order to positively transform and mature the relationship to the self. So this notion of self-confession, not as a way to feel guilty or a way to feel like one is unworthy and has to do some sort of penance, but it's a self-confession as an act of truth-telling to oneself, seeing oneself clearly as one is, not as we'd like ourselves to be, not as we hope we are, but just as we are. And so there's this sense that by writing the self in this way, that we can transform what's familiar into something new. Foucault actually says transform it into something strange, which is interesting, into strange. And in that process, we reconfigure the relationship that we have to ourselves. We change that relationship. And I think, we've talked about this a lot in the Margha program, that what's really important as a transformative catalyst is, can we change the kinds of relationships that we have to ourselves, to the different parts of ourselves, to the different emotions that we experience. We tend to have this very habitual relationship that is based out of grasping and aversion. But our path is a path of transforming and changing the relationship that we have to the self. And Shantideva is providing us with an example of how that can happen. That through these acts of self-confession, through these acts of truth-telling, through these acts of writing the self, that it's possible then to transform what's been so familiar and habitual into something new, into something different, and to reconfigure the relationship that we have to ourselves. So think about that when you're reading this text too. How does reading this text help transform your sense, your familiar sense of self, and your relationship to the different dimensions of yourself? Does it help you? Does it encourage you to look into those darker places and to consider different kinds of relationships that we might have to ourselves? Does it, in fact, actually help to support the practices that we're doing in the Margha program, which are definitely practices of reconfiguring our relationships to the self? I mean, right? That's what they are. How could it be anything else? So I think what I'll end with here is when we really look from Shantideva's perspective at what a bodhisattva is, what is, the vision of what it means to be a bodhisattva, a perfected person, a genuine person that he puts forward. And I think that this vision isn't what we might expect. It's not a vision of somebody who just rises up elegantly to serve humanity with full-blown altruism and compassion for all beings, ready to offer up his body if asked. I mean, right? That's not exactly the vision that comes out of this. But instead, what we find is a person who never gives up, who strives to see himself more and more clearly, who strives to be utterly honest with himself about every aspect of his being, knowing that the more honest, the more clear, the more unbiased he can be with himself, the more possibility there is for a genuine recognition of himself as not separate from others, right? As not something other, but something that is inseparable from other beings. And so maybe bodhicitta or the bodhisattva, at the highest level, right before Buddhahood, can give up his or her body to the starving tigress. But on the path to becoming that level bodhisattva, and remember that there's this description of the levels of a bodhisattva, and I think Shantideva is trying to help us see that the practices of becoming a bodhisattva, the way of the bodhisattva, is a way of self-exploration and self-revelation and self-honesty and self-responsibility. And what's even more important than that is that because he doesn't put forward the vision of a bodhisattva who's going to offer his or her body to a starving animal, what he does put forward is a very workable view of a bodhisattva. It's something that we can imagine that we could actually do, and that feels relatable enough and human enough that we don't say, oh yes, here is this hagiographical figure, who was able to liberate beings by a flick of his finger, right? No, we see a real human being here, just like us, who is on the path and who is working to become who he can fully be in this lifetime. So that's what I wanted to share with you today, and I hope that will help with reading this book. We will be spending much more time with this text in the Margha retreat. And so I hope that you will all be able to come to the Margha retreat, which is going to be online. So many people should be able to join. And we'll have a lot more time to go more deeply into that text and to really work it in this way, to really start to see how this text is it's meant for us. It's meant for us to understand what self-compassion means, to understand how to develop as a bodhicitta, to understand what it means to be a human being on the path. I hope you are all doing well, and I look forward to seeing some of you soon, hopefully all of you very soon in July. If you can possibly do the Margha retreat from afar, then we might have a really fun time. So thank you so much, and have a lovely rest of your day.